we're officially live on YouTube for the Tuesday edition of the Not Your Average Investor Show. I'm your host, Pablo Gonzalez. With me today is a man that needs no introduction. He is one of the foremost real estate educators in the world as the host of the Get Rich Education podcast. He is a real estate investor across the entire country, fully remote these days, out of Anchorage, Alaska, a geography buff. And if you follow him on social media, you may or may not see him on different peaks of different mountains with his shirt off all the time. His name is Keith Weinhold. Welcome to the show, Keith.
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, I thought I'd wear a shirt for this chat today. So if that's okay, I'll stick with that look.
However you're comfortable, my friend, I'm comfortable. And with us, as always, is our fabulous community manager. We call her MTM because she brings us the moments that matter. And because her name is Madison the Magnificent. Say hello, Madison.
Hello, everybody.
All right. And Keith, I don't know if last time you were here, this is your second appearance on the show, right?
Yeah, it's the second time I've been here. Yeah, and it looked like we have a lot of really counterintuitive things to talk about today. I saw 3 counterintuitive points there on the mailer that you sent out to your registrants here. The first is, must rents go down in high inflation and high recession? And they don't. Secondly, it's got to be the strangest one. With higher mortgage interest rates, that typically correlates with higher home prices, not lower ones. And then thirdly, I've sold all my properties in my local market so I can buy properties elsewhere, thousands of miles away, that I've never seen before. So definitely 3 counterintuitive points there that we can hit on today.
Keith, I love doing this with a pro like yourself. You just gave us the perfect piece to put at the beginning of the YouTube video as the teaser for the show. Perfect introduction. But nowadays, what we do, we start off the show with a little tradition that we call the roll call. You ready for the roll call?
Sure, let's do the roll call.
Let's do the roll call. All right. We got our lead off. Oh, we got Denny Davis leading us off from Germany saying Guten Tag. We got Madison in the chat. She's our community manager. If you need anything, welcoming everybody to the Not Your Average Investor Show. We got the man that we call our leadoff batter, but he's batting second today, John Henning, saying good afternoon. We got Misty Johnson from Colorado checking in. We got the ringmaster of the Not Your Average Investor Show community, Drew Barnhill, checking in. We got the early bird of the Not Your Average Investor Show community, Dean Curry, checking in with us from Columbus, Ohio. We got the man that everybody knows as Noah Randari saying hello, everyone, greeting from California. We got Nadeem Shah with his patented good morning, good afternoon, JWB family. He is sitting in sunny Palm Desert. Nadeem, little fact, GC is out in Palm Desert as well, if you want to hook up with him. We got Tony D in the house coming in from South Florida, Anthony Dida. We got Roxana Poppet from Romania. Roxana, that's a new name that I don't recognize. Welcome to the show. Hope you make it a tradition here, hanging out with us on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Love having you. We got Donna Chica is back. Hi to all. Marie Rockoff saying good morning, all. Good morning, Marie. Happy to have you back. We got Bill Shields with his trademarked Buenas tardes, damas y caballeros. Buenas tardes, Bill Shields. Good to have you. We got Victor Alina's in the house. Good morning. Keith, you're bringing out the names, man. Everybody's checking in here. We got Lee Bishop. He's the MVP of the Not Your Average Investor Show community. Welcome back, Lee. We got Marilyn Cotterman from Homosassa, Florida. You know what Homosassa is famous for, Keith?
No.
It's the home of the manatees, man. That's where you can swim with manatees out in Crystal River. It's a beautiful little place.
Beautiful.
Yeah. We got Eddie Harris checking in from Hotlanta. Welcome back, Eddie. Good to have you. Man, this is a good one. We got Ken and Carolyn Moline. We call them the matriarch and patriarch of the first family of the Not Your Average Investor Show community. And we salute them every time they walk in the door. We got Sergio Prieto, who went to school with us at University of Florida. Go Gators, Sergio. Good to have you back in the house. We got Murph Hayes, the Murphinator, coming in with his own nickname, Murph Hayes. I love it, man. You are officially the Murphinator in my book. We got Bob Wiesner, a friend of mine. I'm not going to read his description talking about the Georgia Bulldogs being ranked number 1 because we're a Gator show over here. And that's it. That's our new tradition, man. What'd you think?
Hey, that's a pretty cool roll call. Everyone has their own personality or nickname there. I feel like I've been missing out on a party.
That's the whole purpose of the roll call, is to make you feel like you're part of a party, that we're part of a community. We got Jason Garza checking in from Galveston, Texas. Jason, welcome to the show. But yeah, man, we've developed this really vibrant community, and we have a lot of repeat folks that make this show great, right? Like they add part of the conversation and, get to know each other. And we've hosted events around the country where people show up and we've become good friends, man. It's been a really cool experience since last time you were here. So with that being said, David Blattner checking in from the People's Republic of Massachusetts. David, good to have you. Let's get right into it, Keith. What is the deal with rents in time of inflation? What was the first thing that you teased? Talk to me about it, man.
Yeah, well, what happens to rents in times of high inflation in an economic recession? I think that's the first question that we're trying to answer. So, first of all, if we drop back and look at economics, a lot of times when one economic factor changes, it doesn't change the next factor in line in the way that we think it does. Often it changes it in just the opposite way. So a lot of times these things are really counterintuitive. And I think we've all experienced high inflation, and the Fed has been raising interest rates in order to try to get on top of that inflation. The ideal inflation rate is zero, just like the ideal theft rate is zero. But the Fed has an inflationary mandate. The Federal Open Market Committee, they target 2% inflation or higher, but it has run out of control. So the Fed really has a dual mandate: high employment and stable prices. They're actually still doing fairly well with the high employment despite recessionary headwinds, but the stable prices certainly aren't stable. And I don't know about all of you, but in just the past few weeks, I have gone grocery shopping in Pennsylvania, New York, Washington, and Alaska. And I don't often grocery shop, but circumstances just had me doing this as I traveled. And my jaw really dropped at some of these prices. And I think I'm a pretty healthy spender, if you will, but I have never spent $8 for a bottle of dressing until just last week for the first time in my life. So I think that we all know that inflation's there. And we often think about how inflation affects us, but maybe we don't spend enough time thinking about how that affects our renter, our tenant, or some people prefer to call that a resident, a very important person here in real estate investing. We're concerned with their economic health. We want them to be able to pay the rent. So you might be asking yourself the question, my gosh, if my tenant, if they're potentially more economically fragile or not as well off as me, how are they dealing with this? How are they going to be able to pay their rent, let alone higher rent, if they're paying more for what I see out there? Higher prices for food and gasoline, and electricity prices are up 12% on their own. Airfares are up more than 43% year over year. Now, some of these things can be sat out, like airfare, but everyone needs electricity. If you're paying 12% more for electricity, so is your tenant. Everyone's doing that. Inflation has been up more than 8% on a year-over-year basis for months now. I think all of you probably know that. And most anyone knows that inflation is the diminished purchasing power of the dollar. That's probably the best short definition of inflation. If you had $1 purchasing power a year ago, that same dollar only has 92 cents of purchasing power today. So really, that's the problem, I would say, Pablo, is the problem is, how can your tenant afford to pay a higher rent? Can they even afford the rent at all? So really, that's what I'd like to drill down into and take a look at what happens with high inflation to rents.
Yeah, let's drill into that, right? So you've painted a picture of something that we've talked a lot about on the show. You have articulated it really well in the sense that you have been kind of all over the country in the last couple of weeks. So you're seeing it everywhere. And the idea that it's like an $8 bottle of salad dressing, that's
Right.
that's well beyond the conversation of like prices at the pump, right? We're talking about prices going up for not just gas and milk, but like all the goods of things that people normally pay for on a day-to-day are going up. And that is a reflection of this inflationary time that we're living in. No matter what the Fed is doing thus far, have not been able to really, slow that down very, very much. When I think of that, I think of the average resident who we're talking about, right? Like their cost of living is going up all around them. Would you think that means that they wouldn't be able to afford higher rents? What happens during these times for these residents?
Yeah, so one might have a hunch and they might think, well, if these residents, these renters are paying more for all of these consumer goods and everything else, aren't they going to get squeezed if they have to pay more for rent? What I like to do, it's easy to have a hunch, is take a look at history. What happens historically? We kind of have a guidebook for what happens in these situations. And when we take a look at history over hunches, yeah, Pablo, if you want to bring up that first chart that I shared with you the other day, how do rents move in a high inflation environment? Let's look to the 1970s. And by the way, this spans 1974 to 1985. So it was about 40 years ago. That's the last time we had a high inflation environment. And as you can see, the result, rents went up 7 to 12% every single one of those years, all 11 years from 1974 to 1985. Okay, the last high inflation period that we had. And this is a really germane period for us to borrow a lesson from, because there were also 3 economic recessions during this period. And many think we're descending into recession now. Some think that we're there already. So rents went up 7 to 12% each and every one of these years during high inflation. And by the way, the historic rent appreciation in the United States over the past 100 years is only about 3%. So if tenants are paying substantially more for rent, how can they afford it in high inflation? Well, rents are exceeding historic norms again today. It's happening again today, which you can begin to see over there at the right of your screen. That went back a few months ago. The latest month-over-month period tells us that apartment rents are up about 9% year over year. That's per Zumper's rent report. And right now, the latest month ended anyway, single-family rents are up 11%. That's per CoreLogic's single-family rent index. So that's today, as we kind of think about the right part of that chart there. By the way, it can be difficult to find good rental data for single-family homes. So CoreLogic's single-family rent index, that's a resource you might want to bookmark or take note of for the future. Again, it's CoreLogic's single-family rent index. All right, so this could be a real conundrum to people. Why is this happening? How can rents be soaring at 3 times or so historic norms in this high inflation environment if your tenant's getting squeezed for everything else? And really, there are at least 3 reasons for this. So say you, as a real estate investor, say you're contemplating raising the rent on your resident from $1,600 up to, let's say, $1,800. All right, that's a 12.5% rent increase. You want to raise it from $1,600 up to $1,800. How are you doing that? How have people been getting these rent increases today? Because rents are up 9 to 11% now. And really, one needs to remember that the market is not static. So for the class of housing that you provide to people, there are people moving into that class and there are people moving out of that class of housing all the time. So really, the first reason that rents go up faster than historic norms during high inflation is a lot of times renters step down a class. So a renter might have been paying $2,500 a month for, say, a Class A, which means the best type of housing unit. And they might have to get more austere and step down to a $1,600 to $1,800 rent to pay your $1,800 of rent. So renters often step down. And maybe you're thinking, well, wait, wouldn't that result in a diminished quality of life for that person? Well, yeah, that's what happens during an economic slowdown. So really, that's the first place of 3 that they come from.
That makes a lot of sense. You know, we've talked a lot on this show about the idea that this asset class seems to be more resilient than others. And when I say this asset class, I mean specifically workforce housing, right? The idea that if you are if you are renting like a luxury home or another class of rental home, then you are making the conscious decision to spend discretionary income on rent to live a certain lifestyle. And when times get hard, that discretionary income goes away from other places and into workforce housing, right? Like whether you're spending money in the market, you put it back in your housing and you're doing this stuff. So it provides this idea that the lower socioeconomic regions of the market, they strive for this, to be in this type of home. And the couple notches above, it's a retreat point to them. So there's always this like steady demand in this asset class is kind of what you're saying, right?
Yeah, and you brought up a beautiful point, Pablo. You refer to this as workforce housing. Generally for long-term rentals, so we're just talking about long-term rentals in this conversation, not short-term rentals like Airbnbs and VRBOs. Typically luxurious and beautiful housing doesn't tend to be profitable. and it doesn't tend to leave you with a place for people to step down to. So you want there to be a place for people to step down to during recessionary times, or for people to step up to during good times. So that's why oftentimes you want to invest in a real estate market where you're buying something just below the median purchase price. That tends to be a sweet spot for profitability, as well as people being able to step down from somewhere in times like this, or to step up from somewhere else. And another reason that rents can increase during times of high inflation and a recession is that more roommates tend to double up. Now, this is something you need to be careful for as a real estate investor, and make sure that your lease is written, however it's written with regard to visitors staying no more than 7 days, because in lean times, this is what can happen. But that's another way that renters can weather these rent increases. And understand, though, that during the global health crisis that began a couple years ago, we saw a decoupling trend. Okay, roommates tended to decouple. And will they really group up or pair up as much as they did, say, 40 years ago when we looked at that chart a little bit earlier? I don't know. It was Mark Twain. Mark Twain's actually attributed with a quote you've heard many times: history doesn't often repeat, but it often does rhyme. That's actually attributed to Mark Twain. Another Mark Twain quote. It seems like everything's attributed to either Mark Twain or Benjamin Franklin. Or if you don't know who said it, just say Mark Twain or Benjamin Franklin, and everyone will believe you. But that one really is
Those guys are pretty good with words.
to Mark Twain. But I don't know if there will be as much grouping up this time around. And that is because the work from home trend has become pretty pervasive. A lot of people can't still work from home, but working from home, that necessitates more space. So therefore, this coupling trend might be reduced, not just as much as it was before. But that really is the second way that tenants can afford to pay substantially more for rent during times of inflation and a recession. And then really the third way, and really the way oftentimes that residents have to pay more for rent, is this chronically low housing supply we've had. There are a lot of ways to measure this and a lot of metrics and statistical sources, but many think we need twice as much available housing now just to adequately house the number of Americans that are in the United States. Our population is now 1/3 of a billion, and they have all got to live somewhere. So with this low housing supply, in some markets, prospective tenants are even offering gifts to landlords for a place to rent. Now, personally, I haven't had that happen to me in any of my rentals, but that just shows you this low supply, high demand dynamic. So really, those are the three reasons that rents have stepped up faster than historic norms in inflation and a potential recession. Number one is that renters move down a class. Number two is that more renters double up. And then thirdly, this low housing supply coupled with sustainable demand. That's why it's been happening.
Interesting, man. Interesting. So I got to think that those first two, right? The people that are spending discretionary income on more luxury rental homes coming down, and the idea of people bunking up, that is kind of like market agnostic. And I would imagine that third one of supply demand varies market to market, right? So like a market like Jacksonville, where all these tailwinds of a growing metro area, not enough housing supply, people keep moving here from California and New York and Miami to live in a more low-income place with a really high quality of life. That's got to bode real well as a driver for rents going up during recession versus like let's say like a Cleveland or a Kansas City or something like that, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Of the three factors, of course, all of them are regional, and real estate's a local phenomenon. I'm just talking nationally. But yeah, you're right. Of those three, it's probably the supply demand that's more skewed toward the local factors, especially with hot in-migration markets like you have in Florida.
Interesting, man. Interesting. All right, cool. So that's the first fact that we explored, right? This idea that rents go up during inflationary times, despite renters or residents getting squeezed, right? That seems to make sense, right? Because inflation means prices go up, right, in general. So that's not as counterintuitive as the idea. I would think that when borrowing gets tough, right, like when mortgage rates go up, that rents would come down based on the fact that maybe, actually, I don't know, man. That's where we're going next, right? Like this idea that there is interest rates are going up. That means that generally means we're headed for recessionary times. I would guess that could lead to a drop in rent prices. What do you say?
Well, I'm talking more about the correlation, which is so counterintuitive, that when mortgage interest rates rise, historically, it's the prices, not really the rents, but the rents too, but it's the
Okay.
prices that rise, the prices of real estate, which is completely counterintuitive. I mean, anyone has to easily make the hunch that, oh, when mortgage rates go up, well, obviously that impedes affordability. So prices have got to come down, right? But no, typically, not always, but typically, it's just the opposite that happens. In fact, mortgage rates don't really have all that much to do with the capital prices of a property. And in fact, if you want to pull up the chart that supports this shortly, Pablo, this is remarkable. So what we're looking at here is the last 9 times mortgage rates increased by 1% or more. What happened to home prices? So you're seeing home prices plotted, and each of those 9 plots, it's happened 9 times since 1994, 9 times therefore in the last 28 years, mortgage rates have increased 1% or more. And what's happened with prices each of those 9 times? So each one of those lines represents price movement. And what you'll notice is 7 of the last 9 times that mortgage interest rates rose substantially, home prices rose right alongside them. And this is a real head scratcher for some people. It really understates what I said earlier, that oftentimes a change in one factor doesn't result in the same change that you would think. And maybe you're still thinking, well, wait a second, in what kind of upside down world would higher mortgage interest rates correlate with higher home prices? Well, you're looking at it right now, today. In America, for almost 2 years, mortgage interest rates have rose way high. They've doubled. And what have home prices done? They have rose way high, maybe 25% in the past 2 years. So it happened again. 7 of the last 9 times that mortgage interest rates increased 1% or more, home prices rose 7 of 9 times. Now, mortgage rates have risen so much this time. They have about doubled since they bottomed out around 2.7% in January of 2021, that I don't know that prices can keep going up. I think they're just going to stay pretty stable here for the next year or so. But you might still be wondering, well, how can this happen? Or why would that happen? And we need to think about what happens when rates rise and the Fed pushes up rates. The Fed usually pushes up rates to cool off a hot economy. The Fed usually raises rates when employment is really high and people feel stable about their jobs and there's good GDP growth. People don't make purchase decisions based on mortgage rates as much as they do their life situation. You know, most people that buy homes are primary residence buyers, so they're buying for emotional reasons more so than what mortgage interest rates are. Mortgage interest rates certainly matter to principal home buyers, which moves home prices for the entire market. But more emotional things matter more than that. Say that someone wants to move or buy a home to be closer to an ailing parent, or someone has marriage and children and they want to move to be in a certain school district. So oftentimes it's these emotional reasons that trump the financial ones. And when does someone buy a home? Someone buys a home when they feel stable in their job. And if rates are rising, again, I said the economy was good, people generally tend to feel stable in their job. So the counterintuitive part is that 7 of the last 9 times that mortgage rates rose substantially, home prices rose too. And that's just part of the reason why, and it is completely paradoxical.
Completely paradoxical, right? One thinks, or at least realtors will tell you, right, that if mortgage rates are going up, like you better buy your home now. Or realtors will tell you that you can't get as much home for the same amount of money with mortgage rates going up. And they're right, right? So
Yep.
You would think that would then make people think, well, if I'm not going to get as much money, I'm going to sit in the sidelines and I'm not going to buy a home yet. But to your point, right, these home purchases, generally people are buying homes, not your average investors, right? We're buying homes as real estate investments that are risk mitigated by the 5 profit centers, and we're investing in stuff like that. But the majority of data of home sales comes from emotional decisions, right? People buy homes when they have a kid and they need another room. They buy homes when they're moving to take care of an ailing parent, like you said, or another kind of like life thing that is an externality that doesn't necessarily correlate to the market and the market trends and homes going up. It's generally not an opportunistic buy for most people buying a home, is kind of what you're saying.
Right. For primary residence buying, which is the majority of this market that we're talking about here, which again, move prices for you as a real estate investor that might want to buy a single family rental home. It's that feelings trump facts.
There you go. So history trumps hunches and feelings trump facts when it comes to home prices and mortgage rates. The other thing that I think of when I look at this chart, right? So we're looking at all of these mortgage rates going up, and 7 out of 9 of the times that it's happened, home prices continue to go up. The only 2 times that it happened was 2007, 2008, right? So the Great Recession reminds me of this recession fallacy that we've talked about a couple of times, this idea that we've been conditioned because last time that we hit a recession, home prices went down. But the truth of the matter is that's really only happened one other time in history since the Great Depression. This idea that when we hit a recession, housing prices go down most of the time. And one of the reasons we got into the Great Recession is because housing is so rock solid that it tends to go up no matter what, or at least stay stable, right? Like not drop unless there's this like crazy cocktail of things that happen in the Great Recession. And that's not really what we're headed towards right now.
That is such a good observation. Yes, you happen to notice that 2007 and 2008 were the only 2 times in the last 20 years that when mortgage interest rates rose, house prices fell. And that was due to exceptional circumstances about 15 years ago when loans were poorly underwritten. Anyone could get a loan. There was a glut of housing supply. People couldn't afford their payments when their teaser rates reset and so on. That's the only time that happened. That's a very good observation that you made there. And of course, we're in a very opposite place today. The prospect of a housing price crash today is low. We actually had a supply crash about 2.5 years ago, which helps support prices and hedge us against a price crash, a drop in the supply of homes. That's resulted in a drop of the sales in homes. We have fewer transactions now, and these things actually hedge against a price crash. So I think prices could soften up some more. You know, Lawrence Yun, the chief economist with the National Association of Realtors, you probably see him quoted out there a lot. And I kind of filter what he says because the NAR, they're incentivized to promote home ownership. But me and a number of other economists agree with him when he recently said that next year for 2023, he doesn't see that home prices could appreciate more than 5% nationally or drop more than 5% nationally. I think they're going to stay in a pretty stable zone. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that homeowners are in better shape today. There aren't distressed sellers that need to make a fire sale. Homeowners have record equity today. They don't want to walk away from that. To go back to the mortgage loan underwriting, their mortgage loan was very responsibly underwritten so that they do have assets and credit so that they can pay that mortgage. And there's kind of this lock-in effect. People are locked in at such low mortgage interest rates that oftentimes they don't want to give up that home unless, like I said earlier, for emotional reasons, they feel like they have to. 3/8 of homeowners today don't have any mortgage at all. And then among the group that does have a mortgage, okay, so those other 5/8, that group, 85% have a mortgage rate of 5% or less. And as we know, a lot of them even have a mortgage rate 3% or less. You yourself, you might own a home with a mortgage rate of 3% or less. Mine's 3.5 on my home, by the way. So, you know, I'm staying put. I'm less incentivized to want to sell that home. So these are some of the reasons that help hedge against a price crash. People are not going to fire sale their homes and they don't have to.
So let's put our not your average investor lens on here, Keith, right? We're talking about all these data points and we're talking about all these things kind of in a vacuum, right? Like we are essentially saying that prices are not going to go down, right? Like, or at least we don't believe that they're going to go down. We believe that it's more likely that they stay stable or continue to go up. As an investor, what does one need to understand about that? Like what is, how should that inform kind of like a strategy based on, building a portfolio and trying to build wealth if you're thinking about investing in single family rental properties?
I think it's possible prices could drop a little, but not substantially. I largely agree with Lawrence Yoon on that one. So, we pivot to thinking about you as a real estate investor. It may be making a new purchase of a rental property today. I think it's important when you see all these articles in the major media talking about how it's such a bad time to buy a home because affordability's down and properties aren't moving and all that. All right, that matters. And a lot of that is true, but that matters for that primary residence buyer. So over here, we're remembering that when we buy a property, just call it a single family home that we're renting out to a resident, the tenant pays all of that interest for us. When we buy a property where the rent income exceed all of the expenses, one of those being that mortgage. And you will pay more for a mortgage rate today, just like primary residence homeowners do. But of course, in the United States, like exceedingly few countries, you can refinance that down the road if you want to. This still impedes your profitability as a real estate investor to pay a higher mortgage interest rate. It is nice to know that the tenant takes care of that for you. That can limit your cash flow. It surely will. But I've asked other people still, could you invest in a better place today than residential real estate, where you buy in a market that has in-migration and job creation, where you have a tenant that's going to be able to pay that rent? And you touched on it earlier, Pablo. I invented that real estate pays 5 ways. I would still expect to get paid all 5 ways, 5 profit centers for real estate investors today, even in inflation and a potential recession. That's definitely some not your average investor stuff right there to get 5 simultaneous profit centers.
You are one of the guys that best describes the 5 profit centers, right? We talk a lot about it on the show. This idea that cash flow is only one of the profit centers, and it's kind of what mitigates against the risk of going too upside down and makes it scalable. The idea that your resident is paying down your debt, right? Like no matter how high that interest rate is, your resident's paying it down if you're in a cash flow positive scenario. The tax savings that you get, the appreciation that Jacksonville gets to, really benefit from being best in class of these cash flow markets of how high it is. And then there's inflation hedging. And we've gone back and forth on this idea that inflation is this thing that eats away at your spending power and your wealth. And we've talked about inflation hedging as a profit center before this show. Greg often brings up this term of like inflation profiting, and he always quotes you on it. He's always like, Keith explains this really, really well. So I would love to, we have these 5 profit centers, but we are in this uniquely high inflationary environment. So can you describe to me kind of like the way that you like to describe inflation profiting when it comes to this asset class?
Real estate investors actually profit from inflation 3 ways at the same time. I think it's easiest to harken back to an example I used earlier. If you get a rent increase from $1,600 to $1,800, which is about commensurate with the rent increases that we've seen in the United States over the past year, that 12.5%. Well, if you had just $100 cash flow before you did that, so you had $100 cash flow when your rent was $1,600. All right. So let's say you rent $1,600 and your expenses are $1,500. That's your $100 in cash flow. When you increase that rent from $1,600 up to $1,800, that's only a $200 increase, but your cash flow just went up close to $200. So your cash flow, the money you feel in your pocket every month, just went from $100 to about $300. It's not quite $300 because you might have an increase in operating expenses as well, but you've just 2 to 3x'd the money that you feel in your pocket every single month. How did you do that off just a 12.5% rent increase? As long as you have a loan on the property, you as an investor, your principal and interest payment stays fixed. So you're profiting from inflation. Inflation cannot touch your mortgage principal and interest payment. That stays fixed.
There you go. So it's almost kind of like the reverse of what we started the show talking about, right? Like rents are going up for renters, but if you are owning as an investor and you're locked in, then inflation can't touch that thing and your rents are going to be going up. Therefore, you are profiting from that spread.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. And this is one reason why the Fed doesn't like inflation, and a lot of people don't like inflation. It widens the disparity between the haves and the have-nots. And I just explained part of why. Inflation is going to do that. And you can be on either side of it. You could be a renter where you're at the mercy of rent increases in high inflation, or you could be that property owner that actually benefits from the high inflation. I mean, we're seeing the separation in classes right there. Like, where does that happen? How does that happen in high inflation? That's exactly how it happens.
Really interesting, man. Really interesting. David Blattner brought up in the chat that, prices are going up and down and will vary depending on market and region and price point, right? And I just want to clarify that I'm mostly speaking about Jacksonville, right? Because I'm conditioned to think about it because that's where I'm at and the market that I'm understanding. When we talk about this idea that prices might go down or might go up, that's true. In different markets that may happen. I really do believe this idea that Jacksonville itself, the same way that we described the working class home, the workforce housing, and the idea that during these times, people from a more expensive housing stock will recede and start residing in workforce housing, and people that live in workforce housing will bunk up. I really do think that Jacksonville is this market that, because it's still low priced and high quality of life, kind of benefits from that, right? It kind of benefits from this idea that in these tough times, people that are already living in really expensive markets, they're going to be like, well, I guess it's time to move to Jacksonville. And that's going to continue to have the demand exceed the supply of homes here for a time being. And you're somebody that you're in Anchorage, right? And you were investing in Anchorage and you invest across the country. And you recently decided no more homes in Anchorage that you're owning. Can you tell me about that decision? This idea that we're going into these tough times, and instead of holding it closer to your vest where you're at, you've decided to push your assets further from you geographically.
Yeah, I'm from Pennsylvania. I've lived in Anchorage, Alaska for years now. And actually, you might not yet know this, Pablo. I sold my last Anchorage, Alaska rental property earlier this year. Therefore, this is the first time in 20 years that I don't own any rental properties in my home state. So I know that the best deals are typically across state lines. They tend to be in the United States, Midwest and South. That's where you get a high ratio of rent income in proportion to a low purchase price. That's where you get landlord-tenant law that tends to favor landlords more so than tenants, and you can get a prompt eviction. So I invest in the United States, Midwest and South, often in properties that I have never seen before with my own two eyes. I still get a third-party inspection. I still have an appraisal done. It's kind of a funny thing to think. The appraiser, they don't make sure that the owner ever sees the property themselves in person, right? That's not a requirement. And the appraiser is the one verifying the quality of the bank's collateral. That's the whole job of what an appraisal is. And then I can use another remote tool like We Go Look to just independently get an agent off the street to go check something out for me if I want to do that. But I don't invest in my local market because we have a contracting population. I do invest in places like Florida. I am investing in Florida because there's population expansion there. And I tend to like to invest in or close to metro areas where you have a wide diversification of economic sectors that really hedges one against any sort of downturn. So I don't invest in my local market at all. Prices haven't appreciated, rents haven't appreciated very much. It all goes back to this loss in population. So I want to be in a place that's expanding. And a lot of people certainly think that's crazy. Wait, you own properties sometimes thousands of miles away that you've never seen before? Oh yeah, I have bought properties that I have never seen before, and I've held them for a few years for the production of cash flow, and I sold them for a tax-free gain, and then I'll never see that property. And maybe you're still wondering now, how can I have the faith? Doesn't that seem so backwards or upside down? I mean, this is kind of a show of counterintuition with all the things that we're talking about here, Pablo. But I understand that in real estate investing, which I've been doing actively for over 20 years, not just investing in REITs or something, but I've been investing actively in real estate for over 20 years, ever since I made my first ever home of any kind of fourplex building where I lived in one unit and rented out the other three. The property is only the fourth most important thing because For you as a real estate investor, it's important to be strategic and understand that the most important thing in real estate investing is you. What do you want real estate to do for you? Do you want it to produce cash flow for you? That's a common answer. Or appreciation? Or are you in it for the tax sheltering? Or do you want to buy a property maybe for a lifestyle component because it's on the beach and you want to live there a few weeks a year? So what do you want real estate to do for you? That's the first thing of 4 in the hierarchy. That's what's most important. The second most important thing is the market that you invest in. Jacksonville, for example, is a market. That is a growth market. We can think of markets not just geographically, but also in product type, whether that's condos or single family homes or the mobile home market or whatever. So the second most important thing is that market, getting aligned on a growth market. And then the third most important thing, and this is key to buying across state lines, is the team, the quality of the team that you surround yourself with. Your team might be your mortgage loan officer, or a key team member is that property manager, getting good referrals on the property manager that's going to be communicative with you. And then once you're aligned on that third one, the team, then fourthly and only fourthly, do I begin looking at properties. So that's the hierarchy. It's you, market, team, and then and only then is the property. Now, look, just imagine if someone did this the opposite way and they just bought a property. Oh, and after they bought the property and they figured they didn't like getting texted from their tenant every few weeks. Oh, well, then they tried to find a property manager for that property. And then they tried to figure out the market. And then they try to figure out themselves. And does this even align with what they want? And it's just a total mess. So this is one reason I have confidence buying across state lines, why I don't invest in my home market anymore. It starts with you, then it's market, team, and finally property.
Love that, man. Love that. So it starts with the why, right? Like it begins with the why are you doing this and what are your goals, right? Then you're looking at market dynamics, right? You said that you like to look at high growth markets. You like to be in metro areas. You're not investing in your backyard because it's a shrinking market. So I imagine that you're looking for these like populations that have these like tailwinds of net positive migration and are on with the trends. Is that kind of what you're looking for? What else are you looking for in markets?
Yep. Well, to drill down on one of those, like you mentioned it, Pablo, to your point, I do typically want to be in an MSA, in a metropolitan statistical area of a fairly sizable urban metro, maybe of 500,000 to 1 million or more. Oh, you can just imagine if, let's just say I bought a property in some tiny town of 6,000 people where half of that town's employment was tied to the copper mine at the edge of that town. All right, half their employment's tied to that copper mine. Well, even if I buy that property with a good ratio of rent income to purchase price, and I buy an estate where the laws kind of tilt toward the landlord rather than the tenant, I'm pretty vulnerable there. Now my economic fortunes are tied to the economic fortunes of that copper mine. So that's why I like to be closer to a metro where there's good diversity of economic sectors before I buy a property. That's what drives long-term growth. And that's what keeps a tenant in there paying the rent for you pretty reliably.
Yeah, man, that makes sense. And that's one of the, we talk about it a lot on the show, Jacksonville specifically being one of those MSAs, has 1 million in population, also a very well-diversified local microeconomy, right? The idea that it's heavy government sector of naval bases and armed forces, healthcare being a really big driver here, logistics being a big driver here, and then finance and fintech kind of make that like rounded out thing where you're not worried about one Amazon distribution center shuts down or, a factory leaves town, that this is really good. Tell me a little bit about what you look for in a team, man. How do you evaluate whether a property management team is somebody that you want to trust to invest in from 3,000 miles away?
Yeah, well, just dropping back for a moment to your previous point, Jacksonville is great. You are like the state's transportation and distribution hub. And those are the jobs that can't be outsourced to some other part of the world overseas. Transportation and distribution jobs, they're locally anchored there. They need to stay anchored there. And those are also the types of jobs conducive to someone that wants to rent a place for a few years more so than own a place. So that's something that I really look out for. But in vetting a property manager, I like to go to the Bigger Pockets forums and see how that manager is actually done in the past. Again, history, right? Over hunches, how have they actually done historically. And, I really like to start from there and see what they've actually done and see that they have a good record of communication and rent collection. So that's what I do as a passive investor. And, like how that really looks for me in my life is I own properties in various US markets. I typically like to get multiple properties in one market so I can have one manager, say in a place like Jacksonville, manage a number of properties for me. And then I get an email each month with my monthly statement from my property manager showing all the rent income and all the expenses, and then a distribution in my bank account. So I like to be in a few multiple markets with that trust, understanding that that property manager is actually more important than the property itself. A bad manager will drive a good property into the ground, but that's how it really looks.
Spoken like not an average investor, Keith. I love it, man. We talk about this stuff all the time. Yeah.
Average is terrible. That's a synonym for mediocre. I mean, who wants that?
Agreed, bro. Agreed, man. We got a question here from an anonymous attendee that is asking, please explain what is the tax-free gain at the time of sale? You were mentioning something along the lines of saving taxes. You want to explain that a little bit?
Sure. If you buy a property for $500K and sell it 10 years later for $1 million, you have a $500,000 gain. And yeah, there are some nuances and some basis and some adjustments to that $500K gain. But in a certain timeline, after you sell that property, if you, within 45 days, identify a replacement property and close on it within 180 days, you can take that $500K gain, tax deferred, and put that as a down payment into your next property. So if you made that $500K gain, therefore, as a 25% down payment on a $2 million building, you just traded a $1 million building for a $2 million building and didn't pay any tax on that $500K capital gain from the sale of the property. Now, technically in the IRS vocabulary, it is a tax deferral. It's not actually tax-free, but you can continue to make those deferrals over and over again and trade up. And that process right there that I just described is called a 1031 tax deferred exchange. I have legally never paid any capital gains tax in my entire life because I either refinance properties and pull the cash out or trade up in the manner that I just described there with that 1031 tax deferred exchange. There are some nuances, but that are the basics of how it works.
Got it. So you've never paid taxes on that thus far. So what are the economics of that long-term, Keith, for you with your why? Is that, are you then at some point going to hand down those properties to another generation, or do you just keep it rolling and your cash flow becomes more and more positive? Can you talk to me about the economics of like how that plays out long term when you're deferring taxes like that?
Yeah, I keep it rolling. I keep trading it up to more and larger buildings. And really, in a sense, that way, once I planted the seed with the first smallest property, I'm really not adding any more of my own money as I get this tax deferred snowball rolling forward. And my heirs, I mean, I don't have any children. Actually, right now, my niece and nephew are probably in pretty good shape to get some sort of inheritance from the real estate. And importantly, the basis steps up such that your heirs don't have any tax liability either when you transfer the property to them that way. So this 1031 tax deferred exchange I've been describing has been around for about 100 years. So I wouldn't expect it to go away anytime soon. Although at times presidents have brought it up and they've thought about doing away with the benefit, seeing that maybe it benefits the rich more than the poor. But overall, they've kept it in place because they see that, providing individual entrepreneurs like you and I, the incentive to provide good housing for people is good for society. And, if I can, Pablo, I brought up the word good. Really, we're here to do good in the world. We're here to provide housing that's clean, safe, affordable, and functional. Like, really, that's my fourfold mission in trying to do some good in the world. I mean, imagine if everyone did that. We could probably abolish the word slumlord if everyone thought with that mindset and either managed it themselves responsibly or outsourced it to a good property manager so that clean, safe, affordable, and functional can be done.
I love that, man. I love how popular Uncle Keith has to be, right?
I'm going to get more and more liked the more the niece and nephew realize that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just your niece and nephew. We got somebody here, an anonymous attendee, just checking in saying, huge fan of Keith, right? Big fan of your Get Rich Education podcast, I would imagine, which I highly recommend to anybody that's out there getting educated on real estate. And he says, he actually got me into investing in rental properties after listening to his podcast for many years, 5 with JWB. Keith, what markets are you investing in now or looking to invest in the near future?
Awesome. 5 properties with JWB. They're great from listening to me on the Get Rich Education podcast. Oh, thanks. That really feels good to know that I'm making a difference in helping you out in your investing world. And what was the name there of the?
They didn't put a name. It says it's an anonymous attendee. I'd love to let us know in the chat, whoever put that in there. But they're asking, what markets are you investing in now or looking to invest in the near future?
Yeah, it's been Florida and Texas recently. Those are the 2. And again, it's staying closer to metro areas. And the reason I'm choosing these is because they have a great in-migration. They have laws that tend to tilt toward the landlord more so than the tenant. And they have a high ratio of rent income to purchase price.
Love it. Love it. Keith, man, always fun to have you on here, right? Like, I know this is the second time. I feel like there's going to be more in our future. I have a feeling we're going to get together when you do your Florida tour here in March. But I just want to say I'm just really inspired by the impact that you've created, right? Like, I'm a good friend of I'm not sure who chimed in the chat and what you've done for them already, but Doug Orr is a good friend of mine. I'm very familiar with his story, going from like a Honda factory worker, getting educated on your podcast, and now has 100 and some doors under management. And the fact that folks like you exist are what is propelling the American dream in my eyes, right? Like, where I'm originally from Venezuela, and this like leverage of just like real estate to wealth that's accessible to the working class just doesn't exist. And I think that it exists so much because there's guys like you out there and women out there that are educating the public on it and putting this great service of it, man. So I'm just really appreciative every time that you get to come on, talk to the Not Your Average Investor Show community and spread that education around. I really appreciate what you do. So thanks a million for coming on the show, man.
You know, it's funny. People like to say they're self-made only when they're a self-made success, but everyone is self-made, and you can be a self-made success with the most historically proven asset that there is, real estate. So it's been great talking about it. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks everyone for attending.
All right. And if you were listening on the podcast, I encourage you to go to nyais.com. Join us live for one of these sessions so you can talk personally to people like Keith and the rest of the members of our community. And on Thursday, we will be live again with the JWB Rental Income Property of the Week. Keith, I appreciate you coming on. If you want to not be an average investor, you can't think average. A lot of this stuff is counterintuitive, like we proved today. See you all on Thursday, Keith. I'll see you soon, my friend. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.